Hello, I'm Richard Seltzer. I'd like to share with you an excerpt from my novel Parallel Lives that was recently published by All Things That Matter Press. Here's the first chapter of that novel, entitled The Place Where Time Stopped. Because of the remoteness of the place and its elevation, Abe felt like a newcomer to Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. Here was a world apart, totally separate from the city life he was used to. But he wasn't a young man, nor were the other residents, and they hadn't come here to be cured. There was no cure for what they had, and they didn't delude themselves that they would ever move from here to another earthly dwelling. This was the end of the road, and they knew it. They were old and would only get older. They were here to get old together, perhaps to enjoy what was left of life, ideally to figure out what life was about before it ended, and to do so in deliberate isolation from family and friends. That was the attraction of this remote location. They were on their own. Here they would not become the children of their children, dependent on them, pulled hither and thither to deal with family and social obligations, distracted at a time when time was running out, when they needed quiet and leisure to find their center, if there was a center, to find meaning, if there were meaning. Perhaps it was unrealistic to have such hopes when first arriving at an assisted living facility, and perhaps preparing for the move was a form of evasion and self-delusion. His wife, Babs, had died 3 years ago. As Abe came out of the fog of grief and depression, he had focused his energies on dealing with the practical matters that had to be dealt with, organizing his resources, reducing his recurring expenses, divesting himself of hundreds of boxes filled with the relics of a lifetime. Then he had researched online the facilities that were in his price range and that were sufficiently remote for his purposes. But focusing on the means to his end had been a way to avoid thinking about the end itself, both in the sense of a goal and the sense of end of life, which must inevitably come, whether sooner or later, and which had come much too soon for Babs. This would be so different if she were here with him. No, together they would never have made this choice. As the Uber from the bus station maneuvered along the winding road through the snow-covered peaks of the White Mountains, Abe realized his perspective now was far different than it would have been 50 years before, when he would have fantasized about the nearby ski slopes, the rush he got from the cold wind in his face, the mixture of control and speed, the inevitability of descent balanced by the freedom to choose which way to go and to change his mind repeatedly. He would spend the rest of his days here in ski country, but he would never ski again. It wasn't just a matter of physical agility. He had no desire for such activity. Time was short. He believed that life is an adventure that he could only experience once, and he wanted to experience the end of it to the fullest he was capable of, with eyes open, and hope that there could be a moment when the pieces came together and his life made sense, and the world made sense. Dante was doubly lucky. He had his revelation in the middle of his life, and he started with a structure of ideas that he and those around him shared. For Dante, revelation was a matter of recognizing the connections between that structure and his life and the lives of everyone he knew and had heard of. Abe had no such faith, neither from religion nor philosophy. Without a map, he hoped to get to his destination without knowing what or where that destination was, or even if there was one. Ever the optimist, he hoped to have his personal revelation while he still had the capacity to understand, much less to savor such a moment, before the onset of the darkness of memory loss, which was his greatest fear, worse than death. The ragged face of the old man of the mountains came into view. One moment the rocks formed a face, rough but with mythic power, resonating in the imagination. Then, after the next twist of the road, they were just random rocks. It was a trick of perspective. The experience of the face appearing and disappearing and then appearing again was like an optical illusion involving a shift between foreground and background. Now you see a vase. Now you see two faces. He thought of the classic black and white image of yin and yang, the light defined by the darkness, and the darkness by the light, pairs of opposites dependent on one another, 1 and 0, yes and no, on and off, free will and determination, randomness and meaning. Maybe all that was required for a moment of revelation was a change of perspective. Maybe moving here was the change he needed. Maybe he already knew the answers to questions about the meaning of life. Maybe he had known since birth, but he didn't know what the questions were, so he didn't realize the answers were answers. A cosmic joke. 42 in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Random and arbitrary. Such was the nature of the universe. He pulled out his cell phone, from habit, to check the time, the weather, and the news, but it was dead. The phone was fully charged, he was sure of that, but the screen was blank, and pressing buttons didn't bring it back to life. He knew that cell phones were prohibited at this facility. It wasn't just assisted living. This was set up as a retreat, a place where residents could get away from the world that had been too much with them, late and soon. He expected that. He wanted that. Maybe the phone was dead from a mechanical problem. Maybe when it was in his pocket, he had banged it against something without noticing, or maybe the latest software update had brought this on. He had thought that he was ready to give up his connection to the outside world, but he hadn't realized how much he depended on it. His phone was an extension of his nervous system. Checking his phone was as natural and necessary as breathing. He hadn't realized how visceral his dependence on it was when he decided to move somewhere where he would have to give that up. Maybe this move was a mistake. He should tell the driver to turn around and take him back. Then around the next bend he saw it, white clapboard, but pinkish in the sunset, like the snow around it, halfway up a medium-sized mountain, about 2,000 feet above the highway that meandered below. His new home, the beginning of the rest of his life. The car strained on the steep slope and slipped twice on patches of ice. When they reached the visitors' parking lot in front of the main building, Abe once again saw the old man of the mountains, the great stone face that Hawthorne had written about. From here he saw it as a man, majestic and grand, not as random rocks. He took that as a good omen. Yes, he would go ahead. He wouldn't turn back. He would make what he could of the new life ahead of him. It was time to shuffle the deck and deal the cards of fate. The eternal miracle, a random shuffle determining fate. Is anything random? Is there fate? Or are randomness and fate inseparable, like yin and yang? Abe had read dozens of brochures, had watched dozens of online promotional videos, and had decided that it was here at Arcadia Estates that he would start afresh. He wasn't a 17-year-old falling in love with a girl at first sight. He was a 70-year-old falling in love with a structure and a way of life without visiting, without even speaking to residents. By nature, Abe was deliberate and cautious, at least during his married life, when every decision affected not just him, but his wife and 2 kids as well. Meeting Babs had been different. He knew immediately, felt in his gut, that she was the one, and now she was gone. He once again trusted his gut and was willing to gamble his remaining life on impulse. In photos, Arcadia Estates had reminded him of a once fashionable white clapboard hotel in Plymouth, New Hampshire, where he had grown up. Pemigewasset House was torn down to make way for a college dormitory soon after his family moved to town, when he was in the 7th grade. It was named for the Indian tribe that had lived nearby and that had given its name to the river as well. That was where Nathaniel Hawthorne died in 1864 while visiting with former President Franklin Pierce. Even after it was replaced by the dormitory, Abe had felt a ghostly presence about the property, knowing that a great author had once walked there. He dreaded entering this new world, but had no choice. Since the sudden death of Babs, daily life alone had become a series of chores that he dreaded and did poorly, if he remembered to do them at all. He was living in squalor and was malnourished and lethargic, stumbling from one day to the next with no schedule, nothing that needed to be done, and no one he had to interact with. He was virtually dead, and if he continued that way much longer, he'd be dead literally as well. The price for assisted living was ridiculously high, but he could afford it with the sale of his house and the end of all the recurrent costs of house and car ownership and independent living. The house sale yielded far less than he expected. He had unwittingly let the house deteriorate after Babs died. But combined with Social Security and his 401k, he could afford Arcadia. He had simple tastes, and the assisted living would take care of all the necessities. And if and when his physical condition deteriorated to the point where he could no longer take care of himself, he was guaranteed a spot in the next lower circle of hell, where support and care were available 24/7. And should the worst happen, not death, rather Alzheimer's or some other mental or memory breakdown, he was guaranteed that kind of care as well, behind a locked door where he would be guaranteed the right to a world of his own. So first, he would have to adapt to the lifestyle of a hermit, to enforced and scheduled sociability. He would eat 3 nutritious meals and 1 snack at regular hours in company with hundreds of others. Never again would he have to buy groceries and cook or wash dishes or do laundry or even vacuum his apartment. This many-faceted assistance would free up hours, enabling him to participate in a wide range of communal activities or to pursue personal projects, if he had personal projects, giving him the gift of time and then relieving him of the chore of deciding what to do with it. Stepping out of the car and surveying the rambling structure that would be his new home, Abe savored hints of the past overlaid with the present. He got the sensation all too rarely in today's suburbs, with the same chain stores and gas stations everywhere. Far too many assisted living facilities were cookie-cutter modern, designed for efficiency and heating and cooling, for packing as many residents as possible into the given space. This facility consisted of a series of Victorian houses that had been added to repeatedly for pragmatic rather than aesthetic reasons. He knew that sheltered passages connected the buildings and elevators connected the floors, so there was never a need for a resident to don a coat and boots and venture into the snow, and those in wheelchairs could easily go anywhere on the premises. Back in the 1850s, the buildings had been a cluster of individual homes, a tiny village. Soon after the First World War, they were bought up and converted into an exclusive boarding school for girls. With the decline in popularity of single-sex schools after the Vietnam War, the property was sold again and converted into a nursing home. An extensive library, a relic of the defunct school, had been retained as an impressive-sounding attraction for would-be residents, but declining eyesight and diminished attention spans probably made reading far less enjoyable in actuality than in prospect. Attached to the main building was what was once a barn and carriage house. The downstairs had stalls for 2 horses and a space for carriage and sleigh. Hay was stored upstairs in a spacious loft. The girls' school transformed the loft into an auditorium and gym with a stage and basketball court, and now served as an activity room for community meetings, seasonal celebrations, musicals, performances, and Sunday church services. Legend had it that the clock on the cupola atop that loft had stopped at the stroke of midnight when the original owner's wife died. Neighbors suspected he broke the clock himself and reset it to the time of her death. In any case, subsequent owners honored the tradition and didn't have it repaired, so the house came to be known as the place where time stopped. Standing in the parking lot with his suitcases beside him, little did Abe suspect that this was the beginning of adventure and romance, danger and revelation, such as he had never dreamed was possible. If you enjoyed this story, please let me know in comments, and I'll record more of the same. You can find my books at Amazon. My name again is Richard Seltzer, as in Alka-Seltzer. My email is seltzer@seltzerbooks.com. My most recent books are Parallel Lives, which is this was the first chapter of, Beyond the Fourth Door, and Nevermind. You can find them all at Amazon as paperbacks and as ebooks. They can be read in any order. They are independent stories with overlapping theme and styles. Each presents a different view of reality, a different way of trying to make sense of the mysteries of life.